Good evening to everybody who's arrived. Good to see a nice crowd for considering what the weather has been like and what went on for the last meeting when almost nobody turned up because of the price of petrol. So we must all be getting a little bit more used to the cost of fuel, I think. Yes, I've been a bit slack. I haven't done anything with this weather. I've been just buried on my desk at the moment. I'm co-authoring a book on B24s, surprisingly enough. So that's about all I've been thinking about recently. So I think if Ian is ready, we might launch into this. So Ian's going to talk about the Air Force's use of Leyburn up on the
RAAF Leyburn, yeah.
You call it Leyburn?
Leyburn.
Leyburn. Ah, well, you see, I've never been there.
Yeah, I always used to call it Leyburn, but then I got picked up by the locals. Why do you call it Leyburn? So that's the way they pronounce it in Yorkshire, whatever it was. But anyway, it's Leyburn. So
Oh well, we've all learned something today, including me.
First of all, I remember my dearly departed wife. She said to me when I was about to give a speech, she said, "Yeah, don't get up there and try and be witty, charming, and intellectual." She said, "Just be yourself." Well, you know, today I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to be all three, okay? Now, firstly, without reservation, I express my appreciation to those who have done so much to prepare the history on RAAF Leyburn. Unashamedly, I've used their works, and there's been quite a number of people that I've used. Roger Marks being one, military historian. Roger was the author of Queensland Airfields, World War II, 50 years on. And the other one, of course, was Phil Dines, LAC Phil Dines of 200 flight. He was an actual ground crew at 200 flight during the war. He is the official historian, and he wrote that book, Leyburn's Liberators and Those Lonely Special Air Duty Operations. And I've even pinched stuff from Peter's site. I unashamedly collected stuff from all over the place, which is great. We're all too young to learn, aren't we, firsthand? Let's have a look. First of all, let's explore the airfield itself. Okay, the first record of interest in Leyburn is recorded in the logbook of Wing Commander Eric Reid. And that was dated September 23, 1940. Reid, then with the rank of Flight Lieutenant and part of a 23 Squadron based here, along with Flying Officer John F. Jackson, were instructed to conduct an aerial reconnaissance flight, along with ground checks, searching for suitable sites west of Toowoomba. Now, little did Reid expect that some 5 years later, that he would in actual fact be stationed at this very airfield that he recommended. And we go into that a little bit further down the track. Jackson was also went on to greater things. He, with the rank of squadron leader, was the commanding officer of 75 Squadron in Port Moresby, and he was to give his life in the defence of Port Moresby. And Port Moresby's International Airport is named in his honour, to which I find to be quite touching. I had the privilege of visiting his grave in 2013, and then I initiated the relocation of his memorial. It was way down that end of the airfield because the terminals have been demolished and what have you. So eventually that happened. So his memorial is now very close to the domestic terminal. Let's just dwell upon this a little bit more, if we may. Now, we're talking about a reconnaissance flight in September 1940, which well and truly predated Pearl Harbor. Now, was the Japanese threat that obvious? I suggest it was. No doubt that this that argument or that thought is supported by the fact that Lieutenant Commander Eric Felt was busily engaged at that same time in fine-tuning the Case Watcher situation. Yeah, he started that in September 1939. So regardless of the real threat of concentrating our military assets in coastal areas more prone to invasion, it was clearly realised, and tangible steps were taken to try and get ourselves into a position to wage war from the west should the need arise. Thank God it didn't. That said, it took until March 1942 before Leyburn was actively pursued. Key's report of March 7th, 1942 covered a proposed airstrip on a property named Strathane, close to where the airfield was finally developed. Furthermore, Leyburn was one of 4 airfields provided for the operational flexibility of the United States Army Air Force's heavy bombers in the event that the coastal regions became untenable. Keyes noted that the sites at John Darien, Cecil Plains, Leyburn and Condamine were inspected with Flight Lieutenant Higginson, General Duties Officer from Ambley, on the 19th, 20th and 21st of March. The comments are, Leyburn, Flight Lieutenant Higginson is very impressed with this site, except so far it's some 20 miles away from the railhead. So he was quite okay, but he probably wanted something a bit closer. Now, who was Keyes? What was his background and what was his role? On looking at his war records, his involvement in airfield development became clear. Keyes was a civil engineer after having received a Bachelor of Civil Engineering at Melbourne University. He was clearly well qualified, and from his fitness report, he was an excellent officer. Clearly, he was the right person for the job. On March 28th, 1942, Keyes signalled to the Air Board referred to preparation and design works being needed on some of these 4 sites. But at Leyburn, he anticipated rapid progress by the Main Roads Commission at both here and Condamine. He said clearing of these sites is very light and sites should be available for reception of planes in 1 to 2 weeks. May 5th, 1942, while Keyes predicted fast construction progress and constraints, the constraints of the pre-war departmental procedures, in other words, red tape, maybe took longer than what expected. But he said maybe it took the pivotal Coral Sea battle to swing the May 8th, 1942 directive from the War Cabinet for urgent works to proceed on the basis of plans, estimates, schedules, and to be submitted when available. In fact, Pilot Officer Keyes' report of May 5th, 1942, works inspected on Sunday, the 3rd of May. Northwest southeast strip has been cleared and graded for a length of 7,000 feet and was fit for use by all types of aircraft in dry weather. The camp was erected, tracks graded, and gravel pits and construction of Chinaman commenced. Gravelling of the north-east-southwest runway was to commence on the 5th of May. 1 strip will be available continuously from now on. Water is available in Canal Creek and could be carted to the campsite. Main Roads Commission will assist in this matter. By way of clarification, in this historical in construction concept, the term Chinaman refers to specialised loading equipment, for loading trucks and railway wagons. Also around this time, the RAAF Works Director of Air Services sought clear adoption of the name Leyburn for this field, so as to remove any confusion. Some authorities were still referring to it as Strathane after what the name of the property that Reid and Jackson had identified in September 1940. June 1st, 1942, no doubt heavily influenced by the threat of invasion, works proceeded with due haste, and by June 1942, the 4 airfields west of Brisbane had received close attention to layout design of dispersal areas and associated taxiways and camouflage. Right, so we had an airfield, but what about a camp for the airmen? There is evidence to support that no camp, at least a livable camp, existed at Leyburn by early August 1942. However, available records reveal that camouflage works were proceeding in September. Now, this reflected a report dated September 20th, 1942. The result of this flurry of activity was that Leyburn was fully operational by April 1943, in the sense that both the airfield and the camp were completed. However, there were no takers. as our heavy bomber squadrons were taking place further north in comparative safety because the tide of war was changing. Leyburn then settled down to a period of inactivity and joined a list of some 17 unoccupied aerodromes in Queensland during July 1943. Its designation was Heavy Bomber Airfield with buildings and services for 450 personnel. And let's dwell on the 450 because that comes into play down the track. The first signs of its emergence as an operational airfield occurred in January 1944 in the form of a request from Air Commodore John Summers, Air Officer Commanding Eastern Area Command, RAAF. He asked for a stores building with the explanation, for your information, these strips, together with several others, will be used for the formation of heavy bomber squadrons commencing approximately July 1944. So from the very beginning of World War II, Australia had sought long-range aircraft, but requests for heavy bombers were simply denied by Britain and the US due to prioritisation of the European theatre and domestic needs. So when the war came to the Pacific and the seemingly Japanese unstoppable advance, the long-range strategic strike capability became critical. The breakthrough came in November 1943 when the US finally granted B-24 Liberator allocations to the RAAF, effective from early 1944. In March 1944, 21, 23 and 24 squadrons, then operating from in New Guinea, were withdrawn to be re-equipped with B-24s. Commencing July 16th, 1944, 21 Squadron was to become the first tenants of RAAF Leyburn, where they remained until ordered to RAAF Fenton in the Northern Territory on December 27th, 1944, to recommence operational service as a part of 82 Wing RAAF. Entered 23 Squadron for a period of 6 weeks. 23 Squadron became joint tenants with 21. On their arrival at Leyburn on November 15th, 1944. Now, they remained until March 16th, 1945, when they relocated to Long Airfield in the Northern Territory as part of 82 Wing. Entered 99 Squadron. They took up residency on February 1st, 1945, until they were relocated to Braimaroo on April 30th, which was the same month that particular squadron was made declared operational. Their stay at Braimaroo was short-lived as they eventually moved to Darwin and were still in the process of consolidation when the war abruptly ended in August 15th. Entered 200 Special Duties Flight. 200 flights tenancy commenced on February 15th, 1945, just 2 weeks after 99 Squadron's arrival. The squadron leader, Harold Graham Pockley, more often referred to as Graham, DFC and Bar, was appointed commanding officer. Both squadrons were in the process of forming and many logistical issues to address, including overcrowding of the airfield itself. To address this, in part, there was a sharing of personnel and resources during the initial setup phase. To make things worse, with 200 flights arrival, the overcrowding became critical. We now had 3 formations overlapping, 23, 99 and 200 flight. Now let's have a closer look at this aspect. In reality, the overlapping between 21 and 23 was 6 weeks. Between 23 and 99, 6 weeks. Between 23, 99 and 200 flight, 4 weeks. And then between 99 and 200 flight, 11 weeks. So at the airfield was one part of the equation. Where was the personnel camp to consider? In April 1943, RAAF was quoted by the Director of Air Support Policy as a heavy bomber airfield with buildings and services for 450 personnel with no sleeping accommodation. That's a great idea, isn't it? But, I got a throwaway reference down here, said this business about no sleeping accommodation amuses me because clearly whoever come up with that decision has never experienced a Leyburn winter. It's freezing. Regardless of the 1943 comments, in 1945, the camp was breaking at the seams, as Phil Dine's 200 Flights historian recounts. Quote, messing facilities were most inadequate since the formation of 200 Flight, as there are now between 1,000 and 1,300 personnel at this station. The immediate answer was 99's relocation to nearby Brimaru. That said, the clandestine nature of 200 Flight's mission necessitated the temporary relocation of personnel to Clifton, some distance from the strip, which was out of bounds because of the secret nature of 200 Flight. Anyway, 99 Squadron didn't have aircraft then, he claims, and he said that he was acting warrant officer discipline and took 30 chaps over to John Darien to prepare the full squadron, about 1,000 men. Interestingly, he states they didn't have any aircraft. I looked into that, but time and I couldn't find anything to support it. But one thing, in a holistic sense anyway, however, there is evidence to support that A72187 and A72191 and I assume their crews were transferred from 99 Squadron to 200 Flight. So 99 Squadron's relocation to Clifton and his final departure to Brimaru alleviated the pressure, and the camp was more livable. The airmen themselves voiced views on what they had been dealt with, and one issue was sporting facilities. And Flight Sergeant James Banks, an aircrew veteran of 200 Flight, told me that they lobbied for and were successful in having an area cleared for use as an oval for playing cricket and football. So enter Z Special Unit. 200 Flight's very existence relates to the Z Special Unit. It was born out of the desire of the Allied Intelligence Bureau to have its own secure capacity to insert these highly trained operatives into enemy-held areas by air. Likewise, the resupplying and the maintaining contact with these operatives was critical, and modified air liberators were the obvious aircraft for the job. Leyburn was chosen partly for its isolation. Now, Wing Commander Eric Reed explained that their B-24 Liberators had their camera hatches fitted with a retractable slide for those jumping to exit the aircraft. Parachute ripcords were attached to the static lines in the aircraft, and more than one operator jumping out at the same time is known as a stick. And he said it was possible in a fast stick for 5 operators to clear the aircraft in under 10 seconds. So that's not bad going, is it? It's which was obviously necessary when you're inserting in small clearings in jungle type environments. Now, supplies were dropped through rear hatches in what was referred to as storpedos, an Australian invention consisting of a heavy 3 foot long or perhaps longer cylinder made out of thick compressed cardboard or sheet metal that had a hollow percussion nose designed to crumble at a predetermined rate and to protect the contents. What is said to absorb the shock of the landing. The parachute consisted of a 12 foot with about 3.7 metre canopy, just made out of rough hessian cloth instead of expensive and hard to get silk. All in all, the B-24 modifications were well thought out, and they met the needs of the Allied Intelligence Bureau. Secrecy, Burley's 99 Squadron comments mentioned the secrecy associated with 200 Flight's operations. Indeed, 200 Flight's operations were secret to the extent that they were kept classified for some 30 years post-1945 under the Crimes Act 1914. In 1945, with 99 Squadron relocated to Clifton and then Brimaru, both the airfield and the RAAF personnel camp were 200 Flight's domain and totally cut off from the prying eyes and ears of the local and the wider community. Z Special Unit staging camps were deliberately isolated and access to the field was strictly for training and operational purposes. All in all, this being designed to stop ill-conceived chatter and inadvertently, divulging operational details which could be extracted under torture by the Japanese. The Japanese Kempeitai, who by all accounts seemed to make the German Gestapo look like Sunday school teachers. They were a nasty outfit. The first of the two staging camps was located in the Leyburn State Forest. However, that was abandoned early in the piece due to lack of water and inhospitable terrain. It's pretty poor terrain. As I say, the goannas have got to take a cut lunch and a water bottle. The second and final location was alongside Canal Creek in an isolated paddock, then known as Fogarty's Paddock. So the local watering hole in Leyburn's, which was Leyburn's Royal Hotel, was placed out of bounds. However, I've been assured that in line with the true Aussie spirit and ingenuity, the flow of beer from the Royal miraculously worked. There didn't seem to be any impediment to the beer flowing. And Flight Lieutenant Keith Gamble found out just how well protected Leyburn was when he decided to commandeer a Wirraway and fly unannounced into Leyburn. Gamble's brother, Flight Sergeant Clarence Gamble, was a member of Flying Officer Clark's crew and was reported missing following the crash of A72159 near Dili, Timor on 17th of May 1945. Obviously, the family were deeply concerned to the extent that Flight Lieutenant Gamble decided to put aside his duties as a flight instructor with the No. 8 Operational Training Unit Parks and to make an unauthorised flight to Leyburn to find out what he could. On landing, he was promptly arrested and he left without answers, but with some of his brother's possessions. Enter 380 Bombardment Group, United States Army Air Force. In the lead up to the delivery of our own B-24s and the establishment of No. 7 Operational Training Unit at Tokemwalla, New South Wales, operational training for Australian crews was provided by the US Army Air Force, primarily the 380th Bombardment Group. There is more to this, in as much as when the 380th took up residency at RAAF Fenton in the Northern Territory in June 1943, it was assigned to the RAAF Northwestern Area Command and became part of RAAF Command Allied Air Forces Southwest Pacific Area, where it remained until January 1945, which happens to be coincidental in as much as that's when 200 Flight was formed. It was the only American heavy bomber unit integrated directly into the RAAF's operational chain of command during the war. The air officer commanding RAAF command was Air Vice Marshal William Bostock. Now let's be careful about this aspect. RAAF command was not part of the RAAF establishment in a reporting and operational sense. It was a formation within the Allied Air Forces Command. Bostock reported to Major General George Kenney, a US Army Air Force commander, and through him to General MacArthur. He did not report to Air Vice Marshal George Jones, who had been appointed Chief of the Air Staff. Simply put, for this discussion, Jones supplied the means and Bostock controlled it operationally. Now, in the early stages, the 380th was also involved in the insertion and resupply of the Z Special Unit operatives. The lessons learnt gave rise to the development of tactics and the eventual B-24 modifications. Those B-24 modifications were those mentioned previously that Wing Commander Reid had reported on, an insertion slide consisting of an enclosed wooden metal chute at the rear, blah, 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 I said that, and also to the fitting of fittings and what have you for that static line, where they hook the parachutes up to. Now, but in addition to this, the mid, upper and belly ball turrets were removed and the internal armour plating was stripped away to significantly lighten the B-24s so that they, to maximise their range, and which could be like for 15 to 17-hour flights. However, this effectively reduced the B-24's firepower by 40%. I don't know whether that had a play in something that I'll explain a little later on about the first loss of the 200 Flight. But anyway, finally, the normal defensive or bombing radar units were swapped for what they referred to as Rebecca radar transceivers. Now, this allowed the aircrews to locate in pitch black conditions the Eureka ground beacons placed by the Z Special Unit teams. Diane's historical record mentions the insertion slides, but he refers to these as the slippery dip. And quote, he said the introduction of the slippery dip into the Liberator aircraft followed extensive investigations during late 1943 and early 1944 in trials carried out in the Northern Territory in a B-24 Liberator known as Beautiful Betsy. And being an historical group, you'll know what happened to poor old Beautiful Betsy. It met an untimely end. But this aircraft and crew were allocated to the project by the US Army Air Forces. The need existed for suitable fortified long-range aircraft large enough to carry extensive stores and personnel over long distances and capable of expending additional time seeking out suitable dropping zones before returning to base. The newly acquired B-24 was the perfect answer, but the vehicle for the insertion of the paratroops and other clandestine activities in jungle and mountainous terrain, it presented some additional problems. Anyway, the 380 has provided the additional support training in such matters as parachutes and supply drops. This is the operational room of the 380 bomb group in Fenton. I took that photograph a few years back. That's the remains. At least I hope it looked better when they were actually in there. But yeah, interestingly enough, at the end of that photo, there's another plaque. That is one of the. It has part of the ashes of one of the United States airmen that was part of the 380 group. He came back in that 1988 visit, and he wanted a bit of him to be returned to the place of his youth. So operationally, the focus thus far has been on 200 flight and the 380th. However, during their tenancy at Leyburn, 21, 23 and 99 squadrons were engaged in training. This included bombing practice, and this is evident from post-war recovery of dummy bombs recovered by farmers in the Leyburn area. I rolled up at the Leyburn Historical Society meeting one time, and there's a bomb sitting in the front of the CWA. And I just made some kind of comment that I hope you defuse the thing. But anyway, the training of Z Special Unit operatives also occurred. Parachute training being one. The other was the learning how to exit the B-24s on the slippery dip. Now, ground operational and training place took elsewhere, one such place being Fraser Island, where the Fraser Commando School operated from 1943 right through to 1945. They heavily turned out something like 900 commandos, highly trained commandos. So now I think we need to look at at some of the operations, but Leyburn is unique in as much as it is the most southerly World War II airfield in Queensland. And yet from here, the RAAF took the war to the Japanese, but it was at a cost, right? A terrible cost, a tragic cost. The flight was initially equipped with 6 Liberators, and tragically 3 were lost within the first 13 weeks and 4 days of its formation, and within 8 weeks and 1 day of each other, with the first loss occurring on the flight's first insertion sortie. Now, I've identified something like 122 operations that were planned by the Australian intelligence people, of which 120 were executed. And of that 120, 200 flight played a supporting role in 7. Quite impressive, bearing in mind the size of the flight and the fact that it was only formed on February 15th, 1945, and the war ended a mere 6 months later on August 15th. So let's have a look at those operations involving the flights. First of all, I want to cover those operations in details where 200 flights sustained losses. Operation Seamit. was part of the Borneo campaign. And the operational area was Sarawak. I hope I'm pronouncing these things right, but it was in northwestern Borneo. CMIT consisted of a series of 4 operations carried out by Australian Z Special Unit from March 25th, 1945, which was the first insertion date, until September, October 1945, due to mopping up post August 15th. Its primary objective was to support the Allied operations to secure North Borneo, and this was to involve gathering intelligence and train the indigenous people in conducting guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. In support of the Operation CMIT, 200 Flight conducted 49 sorties, excluding 9 aborted, and they consisted of 14 personnel drops where the operatives inserted numbered 55, 34 resupply drops, and 1 reconnaissance flight. 200 flights losses, Operation CMIT A72191 lost on the 25th of March 1945, the first CMIT 1 insertion and 200 flights second operational sortie, the first being that reconnaissance flight that was just mentioned above. Pockley flew a reconnaissance flight a couple of days before. The distance travelled were vast, however expressed. But if you look at this, you're looking at nearly 7,000 kilometres from Leyburn to Darwin. They must have staged through Morotai and then up to the Mindoro, which was an Allied base in the Philippines. And then from there, they then returned down and did the insertion in North Borneo. Close to 7,000 kilometres just to get there, and then they had to return home. 200 flights 200 flights involvement predated the March 25th insertion. As I said, the first recorded flight was that reconnaissance flight flown by Pockley on March 19th. Pockley returned on March 25th with Flight Lieutenant Frank Ball in A72159. That were 2 aircraft, and successfully they inserted Major Tom Harrison and his team in Barrio at Sarawak, and then flew west towards Brunei Bay and then turned north towards Mindoro, and then he disappeared. A United States Navy aircraft made the final visual sighting of the Liberator flying at 5,000 feet just north of Jesselton. Now, unconfirmed wartime reports indicated that the aircraft descended to attack a Japanese merchant vessel and was shot down. Subsequently, the Allied searchers located oil slicks, which indicated that the north coast of Sabah is the final resting place. So here we have Pockley. So Pockley was twice decorated for outstanding airmanship while flying Sunderland aircraft at Mountbatten in England as part of 10 Squadron RAAF. After nigh on 2 years of flying anti-submarine patrols, he was awarded his first DFC in July 42. He was awarded, 4 months later, he was awarded a bar to this DFC, once again for meritorious service. Now, based on his UK experience, there's probably little doubt that it was a Japanese merchant ship that was sitting there that he would have attacked it. Regrettably, this time his luck and that of the crew of as well as Major Ellis, a British Army officer serving in Z's Special Unit, lost their lives. And this is what I think is worthwhile mentioning too, or dwelling upon, is the fact that the stripping of the top and the base thing reduced their firepower by some 40%. I don't know whether that had a play. But Wing Commander Eric Reed then assumed command of 200 Flight following the death of Squadron Leader Pockley. Operation Sunbaker. Sunbaker was a short and sharp sortie with a tragic ending. On May 17th, Flying Officer Archibald Clark, flying A72159, was charged with the task of inserting a team of operatives into enemy lines or behind enemy lines near Dili, the then capital of Portuguese Timor. Now, Timor was heavily fortified with anti-aircraft batteries, and the mission carried immense risk. On the night of the May 17th, while attempting the insertion, 159 was targeted and shot down, and all 15 men on board were killed. This included the 10 RAAF aircrew members and 5 Z Special Unit operatives. Operation AGAS. Operation AGAS was a series of 5 reconnaissance operations carried out by Z Special Unit in 1945. Like Operation CEMET, it was a part of the Borneo campaign and a sister operation to CEMET. Its objectives being and timing were the same as CEMET's, with the primary difference being the areas of operation. CEMET was carried out at Sarawak, whereas AGAS was conducted at North Borneo, present-day Sabah. Now, in support of Operation AGAS, 200 Flight conducted 35 sorties, consisting of 5 personnel drops, where they inserted 13, 30 resupply drops. 200 flights lost was A72177, commanded by Flight Lieutenant Keith Emmett. On May 21st, Flight Lieutenant was engaged and a resupply sortie when it was seen to clip a tree and crash. Their remains were recovered by Z Special Unit personnel on the ground. The deceased were buried with full military honours as best they could under those circumstances. They've now subsequently been removed to Leyburn and Malaysia. Now, in addition to Operation CEMET, Sunbaker and AGAS, 200 Flight participated in Operation Marbot, Sunable, Sunlag, Suncob, and finally Platypus in 3 of its 11 phases. Now, these remaining operations were less eventful for 200 Flight, but for those inserted, the outcome was in many ways tragic. The objective areas and operation and timing varied. The Sunable, Suncob, Sunlag were in East Timor. Marbot, the Gazelle Peninsula in Papua New Guinea, that's on the island of New Britain, and Platypus, which is in Borneo further north. In support of these operations, 200 Flight conducted 19 support sorties, excluding 3 aborted, consisting of 7 personnel drops with 25 operatives inserted, 10 resupply drops and 2 reconnaissance flights. Now, throughout its short existence, the 200 Flight achieved quite significant results. If you look at this, the number of sorties that it was actually involved in was the number of operations was 16, the number of sorties 116, the number of drops included were 26, resupply 74, reconnaissance missions 4, number of aborted missions 12, number of personnel drops 93. But this last figure is quite amazing. 390,000 pounds of stores, or 176,900. 200 Flight continued flying after the end of the war, after the war ended rather, on August 15th. It continued dropping AIB operatives and supplies until mid-October, probably no doubt as mopping up activities. And then it was used to fly AIB personnel from Bougainville and Finchhaven and New Guinea to Australia, as well as conducting courier flights. 200 Flight's last sorties were leaflet drops, and the unit was disbanded on the 15th of December 1945, with the final exiting of RAAF Leyburn taking place on April 12th of 1946. The airfield then fell into obscurity and briefly awakened for the 1949 Australian Grand Prix. It is now broken up into hobby farms and weekenders. RAAF Leyburn serves a new purpose, one diametrically opposed to the horrors of war. While RAAF Leyburn is no more, its proud heritage and its very spirit lives on in the hearts of a grateful nation, and in particular the Leyburn community, who are intensely proud. This is the areas of operation. It's quite amazing, but it shows you to the east you've got the Rabaul sorties and Timor, and then those others in Borneo. I made comment before about the Kempati. Some of those I didn't want to go into too much detail on that, But some of those sorties were sorties that followed up others where ground operatives allegedly had radioed through calling for extra people to come in. Those initial ground operatives had got into the hands of the Japanese, the codes and what have you. Those other operatives were actually inserted fell into the hands of the Japanese. It's quite terrible. This imagery displays RAAF Leyburn today. So you can see this is today's imagery. When I say today, it's current imagery from Google Earth. You can see it quite clearly, and I've added that to do it. This is the dispersal of the military assets in Leyburn. Up to the top, you'll see the actual airfield itself. Further down is the RAAF Airmen's Camp. And then you got the township. Then the first, that's the final site. You got the first and the final. The Leyburn and District Historical Society knew of the existence of that first site. They knew the story. They knew that it had been abandoned, but we didn't know where it was. And in liaisoning with Peter, he sent me something and he said, try this. He said, I can't guarantee its validity, but have a go. It was spot on, absolutely spot on. So to me, this proves without doubt the benefits in, you've got to share stuff, in the process of sharing, it's quite amazing. Okay, coincidences of fate. I don't know if any of you have read that book, Fate is the Hunter by Ernest K. Gann. I recommend it. Fate is the Hunter. Now, indeed, Gann, in real life, tempted fate as a pilot, both in war and in peace. His view was that fate was not a comforting or divine plan. It was a capricious, random, and relentless hunter that pursued all pilots. I remember my flying instructor who cleared me for my first solo flight on April 2nd, 1971. He said, Ian, one day you will have an aircraft on your hands that you wish the hell you didn't. It happened. Yeah. Now let's relate coincidences and fate to this story that we've just covered. Wing Commander Eric Reed and Squadron Leader John Jackson. 4 years after identifying Leyburn, or Strathane as he called it, as a suitable flight, Eric Reed assumed command of 200 Flight and flew operations from that very airfield that he recommended. As we said before, John Jackson went on to command 75 Flight and heroically died in the defence of Port Moresby, and Port Moresby International Airport bears his name. Let's have a look at the things out of Pockley's. Flying officer Charles Cox was not of Pockley's crew. He was a captain in his own right. Flight Lieutenant Ray Storer survived the war at Cox's expense. Pockley tried to poach Flight Sergeant James Banks of Bridges' crew as bomb aimer. It wasn't an order, and Jim declined. Jim survived the war at Sergeant Les Tompkins' expense. Just between you and I, you know why he knocked it back? So if you look at the composition of the Pockley's aircraft, it was virtually full of officers, and he said, no thanks. So his dislike of officers saved his life, but unfortunately Sergeant Les Tompkins paid the price. Oh, there's another story too, but I won't go into that. But look, I now choose to dedicate this presentation to those who served from RAAF Leyburn, and in commemoration of the heroic deeds of the airmen of 200 Special Duties Flight and the ground operatives of Z Special Unit, especially the 32 airmen and 9 ground operatives who gave their lives in the preservation of a way of life. We must remember that diametrically opposed are unit records and the memories of grieving families, where successive generations have lost a loved one. One refers to the loss of these men as history, whereas to family and friends, it will forever remain a tragedy. I'd just like you to think of that, please, as you activate this next slide. That is Flight Sergeant James Bank, OAM MID, truly one of nature's truly great gentlemen. But that thing says, their eyes have seen what no man should see. Their ears have heard the cries and the tumult of war. We owe them a debt so great that we cannot forget, lest we forget. There's the acknowledgements. I sincerely thank all who've taken the time to try and preserve our history. I think it's absolutely wonderful. May I suggest that when you get home that you do a search on YouTube and just type in Leyburn, the war years, and you'll see that that thumbnail come up. That is a presentation that I produced for the Leyburn and District Historical Society, which covers in more graphic terms much of what we've discussed today. It's been a privilege, and I sincerely thank you for the opportunity of being here and expressing these thoughts with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Whilst I know a lot of that, there was a lot of that I didn't know as well. So it's good. Thank you very much all for coming, and we'll close it up. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.